do that for that. So we the idea is to still continue to use it as an e-participation tool, not an e-democracy tool.
Mhm.
Just we are in an experimental mode in this moment here at the Digital Initiative. We have launched this initiative 1 year ago, and it's already we have learned already quite a lot. So what we want to do with this is really up to all of us to see. Um, because implementing a fully fledged participatory and at the same time evidence-based policy making tool takes years. Um, it's an open question, your question. It would be nice sometimes to share ideas at the three levels, at the level of the model and the tool, at the level of the engagement, stakeholder engagement um, methodology, and the webinar today is an example of that. And last but not least, about the funding, the actual outcome of the journal we are doing into the future, which is generally content and strategy release.
Because I think it's quite clear that technology is going to allow us to collaborate in different ways. And when we do talk about participatory democracy, we now have the tools which can move us closer to more people having input, and with crowdsourcing of strategies. One of the things that one of the vice chancellors in Australia has done is to use the IBM platform called Unijam to actually crowdsource the strategy for the university. So it was open for 48 hours, and staff, students, alumni, government policymakers, people from the business community firstly profiled themselves and then became a member of the Unijam. And so for 24 hours, for 48 hours, people made a contribution, and it might have been a contribution of ideas or of evidence or journal articles. In a sense, it's like a private Facebook. It was quite a sophisticated platform. And then when the 48-hour period expired, you were able to get a profile or of views from the different stakeholders. So it was quite an interesting experiment. The Vice-Chancellor was a little bit disappointed because he said only 12.5% of the students participated. He was hoping that there'd be more than that. But any of us who are social scientists and have been involved in social survey technique will know that 12.5% is not too bad, actually. So I think this is just the beginning. And this Vice-Chancellor is the first of the Generation X Vice-Chancellors in Australia. He's only 39. Most of the other Vice-Chancellors are in their 60s. So there's a new wave of thinking starting to come into the universities. But he's the leader, I suppose, being only 39 and being from Ireland. He's also quite a jovial person and a good storyteller.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. And I know that Australia is very, very advanced in democracy too. I've read a number of articles about it. But certainly we agree at the beginning. While we know that we can master more or less the technology, we don't know what kind of implication and impact would this technology have on the society. And that's really a big challenge. But I would now maybe take all these breaks at Stephanie on another maybe occasion. We wait more for 3-4 minutes of academic time, and then we start.
Okay. It's gone off. Oh, here we go again.
19 participants, including the speakers. Of course, you can read it on the top right side there. is important, Stephanie, is that what we have learned in 1 year is that there is an important distinction between engagement and, of course, the participatory conversations that we might have in all possible flavors, including the webinar, and the sense making of the conversation and of the content. Very often, when you are in a participatory conversation or in a standard meeting, you are at the level of bullets, keywords, of mind map. Then writing the narrative out of it is a challenge very often. In terms of resources, in terms of using the right techniques, and in terms of reflecting really the collective wisdom into a text which reflects really the aspirations and also the rational thoughts of participants. And that is really a huge effort, and we are learning a lot on that.
Because dot points are not a strategy, are they?
Yeah, it's, actually we use the tutorium as a container, as a virtual space where people can provide content, can co-create the content in a synchronous way. While when you are in a conversation, of course, you enjoy a lot to speak, but not too much to write. So actually, the percentage of contributors on wikis, including Wikipedia, is extremely low. It's a very little percentage of the whole universe of users. And we are facing a similar situation with Ethereum. Social networks are like that, and people like to exchange the comments and play in an interactive way, rather than making synthesis and writing the text themselves.
Yeah.
Right, we have still 1 minute, and then then it's time, and then we start.
Yeah, it's just the video that is gone, but Franco is still with us.
Still there, simply that now, as we agreed, it will be Xavier welcoming all the participants, and then of course me, and then of course you all for the interactive side of the 21 participants.
I hope you can still hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I wouldn't be wanting to extend my welcome just to myself.
Okay, so I think it's 5 minutes past 1, so the academic time has ended, so let us start. Welcome everyone, I'm Kasia, I'll be facilitating this meeting. I work for the Futurium engagement team. I'm very happy to welcome here Xavier Prats-Monet from DG Ed, DG Education and Culture, and we have also with us Stephanie from Ernst & Young, Fai, sorry, the partner of Ernst & Young from Canberra, Australia, and a professor at several universities, for example, University of Sydney. So Stephanie is our expert in education, who will share her vision on the future of education. But before we do, Xavier will welcome all the participants, as well as Xavier will react to Stephanie's vision to talk more about the policy ideas. Just to quickly walk you through the timing of today, we'll have 20 minutes maximum presentation of Stephanie with some slides, then a quick reaction for Xavier. We'll open the floor to the questions. You can use already the chat window to talk with us, so comment or pose the questions even when Stephanie will be talking, and then we will also open the floor to the open discussion, and this is the way also to exchange the views with all participants, and I'm sure that our speakers are very much looking forward to this part. So Xavier, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, hello everybody, and a very special hello to Stephanie and to all those of you who are now in Australia, because in Australia, which is a wonderful place, it happens to be 9 p.m. today, and it happens to be, I think, the Queen's birthday. So this means that it's a national holiday, and to have Stephanie and other colleagues participating in this discussion at 9 p.m. on the national holiday is really something, and it says something about their engagement and their willingness to help. So thanks especially to the Australian friends from down under. A very important thing already to us, what for us in Europe is the far east, for you, Stephanie, is the near north. And we should really, really listen, because although somebody some time ago called Mercator put a map with Europe in the middle, we should forget that actually the world is round, and it will be round for a long time. So again, my thanks to our Australian president, to Stephanie, in the first place. Just a couple of words to say how great it is, I think, to have something like Futurio. Not because we will guess the future, right? You know, guessing the future is like seeking happiness. It's something you have to do, but you never get there. But you still have to do it, and it's really important that we try to have a better understanding of what's ahead of us. And this is particularly important in the field of education. We really feel at the Commission of DG where I am in the education department, that education is now about to undergo a really, really extraordinary transformation, which can be a challenge or an opportunity, depending on how well we manage it, how well we understand it. So I think that these initiatives are really important, precisely to give us a better understanding of all the limitations of the exercise. So without further ado, and with again our thanks for their participation, I'd like to just give the floor to Stephanie to tell us how, from her very particular perspective, of somebody who looks at education from a global perspective, from an extraordinarily important outfit like Ernst & Young that sees the reality of companies and human capital challenges. How do you see the challenges for education? How do you see digital learning coming in? What is your vision about education in the future? Stephanie?
Thank you very much, Deputy Director General, and it's wonderful to hear your voice again. We were very impressed by your presentation when you came to Australia fairly recently, and we discovered at that time that the challenges facing education are actually global in nature, and I think we do have a lot of information that we can share with each other. So we've now got 10, 15, 20 minutes for me to cover some of the issues that I think are rolling down the path towards educators in the community at an unprecedented rate. The challenges for education has been much debated, and there's been a lot written about the changes in education that are upon us. But I would say in the last 2 years, it's where the conversations have escalated. And I think part of that has been through the introduction of the massive open online courses that have been initiated in the United States and by universities with global brands. So I think from that point, people really started to look at the education sector and thinking, how is it going to change? I think the only thing that we can be certain of is that the pace of change is going to accelerate. But that doesn't mean to say that in the past 50 years, education hasn't changed. And there are a number of people now that are quite anxious about the changes that they see occurring, particularly in the university sector. There are some who are early adopters and very enthusiastic about the potential of the changes that are occurring, where there are others who are more constrained, more reserved, and have concerns about the direction of the change. I think what we've got now is actually a polarisation of views. But if we look at the way universities are currently operating, you can see that there's been incremental change across the university. But perhaps it's been incremental at a pace where we haven't really noticed that the changes are actually fundamentally changing the way in which universities operate. So, for example, the idea of the virtual campus. Many universities now have virtual libraries. My former university, Monash University, started with a virtual library more than 15 years ago, and now students will report that they very rarely actually go into the library to consult with materials there. They'll go into the library to meet their friends, but not necessarily to access material. So we have the beginnings of a virtual campus. Question about whether academics should be teaching or whether non-academics should be teaching courses. In a sense, we've got the slow introduction of the casualisation of the academic workforce. So there are people teaching within universities who are not professors. So when there's concern about whether academics or non-academics should be presenting material in the university space, I think we've already started down that path. A second area is around a collaboration of the curriculum. Already we've got universities who have licensed their curriculum to countries where they want to fast-track their education. And in a sense, MOOCs are also licensing curriculum. We also have recognition of prior learning. So if a student comes from a university from overseas, we'll often give 2 years credit. So when we're looking at where students are going to find their credentials or find their courses, it's not unusual for them to find them in different spaces, not necessarily within one institution. There's also concern around whether independent groups should be assessing credentials. Now, within the medical field, this already happens. In Australia, overseas, we have the GMAT, we have the SAT, we have independent groups who are assessing the preparedness of students to come into particular courses. So, as I said, we've got the polarisation of views around the changes that are occurring in universities. But what I've tried to illustrate in this list above is that the change is already starting to happen, and that perhaps it's happening at a pace that we don't actually notice and we don't feel so threatened. But I think what will happen in the future is that pace of change will increase, and these are the sorts of challenges that we need to be aware of. Now, my task today was to look at education in 2050. My first reaction was, I'm struggling to think about what education might look like in 5 years' time because of this pace of change. But what I will do is just start giving some thought to what the education space might look like in 2050. It might actually only be as soon as 2020. But I'd like to firstly describe the student of the future, and then the academic of the future, and the campus of the future. So what will the student of the future look like when they jump out of bed in the morning? Will they be racing off to classes, or will they be moving to their desk and accessing their laptop and joining a group discussion in their own bedroom? I would imagine that that's going to be the case, that students are not necessarily going to be of a cohort of 18 to 25 at the undergraduate level. I think students of the future are going to be of all ages. We're going to have more of a focus on part-time learning and, by definition, lifelong learning. If there are some who are fortunate enough to go to a physical space of a university, I think what we'll find is that those people will be living on campus to actually maximise the education and on-campus experience. But I don't think they'll be just working for 26 weeks of the year, 2 semesters, as it is in Australia now, and some universities have trimesters. I think it's going to be much more intensive than what it's been in the past, because we'll need to leverage the limited assets that we have, which are the university physical construct. So I think the 2-semester organisation of the curriculum will fade away. So as I said, I think that students will be of all ages. Some of them will be looking for credentials, but others not. It may be that the credential actually becomes less important than it is today. In fact, a challenging question that I was asked a few days ago, and that was, would I have gone to university if there was no need for the university credential? Would I have gone to university of my own volition and not being incentivised through getting a credential? And I think that's a very important question, because I think they're the sorts of questions that students are going to be asking on a more regular basis. So I think we're going to have more lifelong learning. We're going to have more part-time learning. We're going to have part-time students who will be working through virtual communities and in virtual campuses. But I also think we're going to have students who are from many different countries. So there is a latent demand for higher education in particular. If we would think about 40% global participation in higher education, this demand will come from places such as India and Indonesia and the continent of Africa. So how are we actually going to meet this latent demand? But we can be sure that the student population is going to become much more diverse in terms of age, the way they engage with the university curriculum, and also the countries from which they're from. So now what I'd like to do is to describe the academic of the future. When I started off as an academic, it was my responsibility to do research, teaching, and participate in university life, in administration or in community development. So I needed to have a toolkit which would allow me to do all of those tasks. If we're thinking about the university of the future in 2050, we need to remember that that's at a time where Generation Y academics will just be starting to retire. So we will have had a period of 20 or 30 years where Generation Y have been the academics, and they've also been the leaders of the university. So I think, given what we know about Generation Y now, we know that they are going to create very different spaces to the spaces that we've created in the past. But let me think about the way in which the role of the academic is going to change, and we can see the beginning of this already, the disaggregation of the role of the academic. As I said, when I started off as an academic, I had to do research, I had to teach, and do administration. My view is that we're going to have a disaggregation of this role. You'll have researchers who will mainly research. They may be involved in informing curriculum. They may be informed in training some of the new researchers who are coming through. But I don't think every university academic will be expected to be a researcher. I think those researchers will have a closer relationship to industry than what they currently have, partly because there's increased demand for high impact research. We're faced with a number of global problems, and the answers will come through global teams and focusing on those problems. So I think we're going to have a closer relationship with industry, and they're the ones who are going to be able to help us turn our research outcomes into practical application. In some cases, it will be the commercialisation of research outputs, but in other cases, it will be the implementation, perhaps in a policy sense, of our research outcomes. And the researcher will no longer be working alone. There are some researchers who still work in labs of just a few assistants or with a small team. The challenges that are facing us today require global teams to solve global problems. And they won't be discipline-specific teams, they will be interdisciplinary teams, but they certainly will be global teams. With respect to those in the universities that are involved in teaching, as I said, I think the teaching role is one that is going to undergo quite major change, and you can see the beginning of this change in some universities already. You'll have some academics who will be mainly involved in curriculum development. There will be others who will be involved in how you put that curriculum onto a flexible platform. And then you'll have other academics who might be what we would regard as the star academics, those who are going to present. So if it were me as an academic, I wouldn't be expected to do all of those roles because they're actually very specialised. And we're not expecting individuals to have all of those capabilities. So what we're going to see is the disaggregation of the responsibility and of the skill set of academics. We're going to have more sharing of curriculum, and in fact, when you look at curriculum that's taught globally, they estimate now that about 60% of curriculum is not unique. So why isn't it possible for us to better share the curriculum, and especially the curriculum that's been very well researched? Now what I'd like to do is to reflect on the campus of the future. One of the challenges facing many academic leaders today is whether we should be refurbishing the building stock that we have, whether we should be building new buildings, or whether we should accept that the virtual campus is going to become predominant, and we need to think very carefully about the physical assets that remain on a university campus. But it's fair to say that the space that we do have on the campus of the future needs to be flexible, because, as I said, the education industry is changing so quickly that we can't actually anticipate what it's going to look like in 20, 30 years. So what we need to do is to actually set in place structures that are flexible enough to allow us to shift as the demand shifts and as the requirements of industry shift, as the requirements of the community shift. We need to be flexible to actually keep up with those demands. But I also think there will be no doubt that campuses will be obviously completely wireless, and I suggest that they'll also be completely paperless and cashless. So I think they're going to be, in that sense, much more comfortable places to work. So now if I just reflect on some of the areas where I think policy will need to be watching and where we need to be quite clever about our policies. The first one, and I'll just name four, and because this is the area where Xavier is obviously the expert, and I'm just trying to throw him a few balls so he might be able to respond. So the first policy implication, I think, is going to be around the working conditions for academics. I think one of the impediments for change in the education space, and not only in universities but also in our school system, is around the organisation of labour and protecting the workspace, the working conditions of academics, but at the same time allowing change to take place. The second issue is around the requirement for seamless IT platforms. So Generation Y already expect immediate feedback and integrated systems. So I think a major impediment for universities to actually keep up to date with student demands, but also with our research needs, is to develop robust IT platforms. And it's not only the physical infrastructure, it's also the capability of academics to actually make the best use of those platforms. The third area is around the validation of credentials. So right now, academics within universities have the responsibility to validate credentials. But is that going to be the case in the future? And there are many who will argue that this is a space that's going to change and change very quickly. And in fact, only this morning I read a paper that was arguing that there's a conflict of interest for universities. If they're going to be the ones who offer the teaching and provide the assessment, should they also be the ones who are providing the credentials? If we look at our high school system in Australia, the examination of high school students is not done by the individual schools. It's actually done by an outside body, and usually government. So why are universities in a different space? So I think the whole validation of credentials is a very controversial question, and it's something that we'll need to look at quite carefully. And the last area is around the collaboration between industry and universities. I've made the argument that researchers need to be more engaged with industry so we have more focused outcomes. I'd also argue that industry needs to reach down into universities and to assist universities in developing curriculum which will make the transition from university to work smoother than what it is. And not that universities are there to prepare students for the workplace in a substantive sense. I think we need to encourage skill development for students, but the actual jobs that they'll be doing perhaps in 10 years' time haven't been invented yet. So we're not training them for specific tasks, but we are training them to develop the skill set that they'll need for this flexible relationship. But in order for universities and industry to collaborate in a more effective way than what they are now, both in research and teaching, there needs to be mutual trust. There needs to be cultural understanding, because there is a chasm in terms of the cultures between academia and industry as it stands now. But as these new generations come through, hopefully academics will be more entrepreneurial, and hopefully industry will be more focused on what they want the graduate attributes to be. But the incentives also need to change, and I guess this is where we come to the policy platform. How do we incentivise academics to move more into industry, and how do we incentivise industry to participate in the challenges of education? So they're the four policy areas that I think are going to be quite controversial. But I just wanted to conclude by making a fairly strong statement about what's important to keep within the university. As I said, we're undergoing rapid change, but I think there are three elements that can't be sacrificed in these changes, and it's everyone's responsibility to hold on to them as tightly as possible. The first is to maintain quality in the education experience. We need to ensure that we're not in a race to the bottom, but we're actually introducing policies and changes that will help us to improve the quality and the efficiency of education. The second area is around access. I would argue that most educators believe that access for everyone is an ideal. So we are not wanting to exclude anyone from the education process. So policies, any changes should go to build the access of people of all ages, from all economic backgrounds and from all countries. And the third pillar that I think we need to hold on to carefully over this period of rapid change is the issue of academic freedom and freedom of thought as a pillar that's quite crucial for a functioning society. We don't want the academic to be co-opted by industry necessarily, particularly in the environmental area or in other areas of research. We don't want the academic to be co-opted by a particular government that might have thoughts around policy that perhaps are not good for society. And we don't want the church and universities to become too closely linked. We want to have academic freedom, freedom of thought. And so quality, access and academic freedom, I think, are the pillars that we need to hold on to as we go through this roller coaster of change. So on that note, I'll conclude. And I understand that my good friend, the Deputy Director General, is also going to make some comments.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll get hold of these questions that were flowing in the chat that were a reaction to your thoughts. And before we go to those questions, I will give the floor to Xavier. As you announced, I'm really looking forward to your thoughts on what Stephanie suggested as for the European policy, but also on maybe a short recap of what you've already been doing in the digital education policy in DGAC. Xavier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to Stephanie. Actually, as you say, Stephanie, your good friend, the Deputy Director General, could just shut up now because you've made such a compelling picture of what's coming. Let me just perhaps start the conversation with a few comments. Actually, what struck me, especially from a policy point of view, is not so much what you're saying about education in 2050, but how fast we're going to get there in 7-8 years' time. The point I'm trying to make is that, as you said, it's very difficult to guess what the education, or by the way, our society's landscape will look like in 2050. But what is really compelling in your presentation is this sense that change is already happening, that is happening very quickly, and that it involves a real transformation of education with a huge number of challenges, but also opportunities, which brings me to another comment, which is that indeed, as I think our host Connect was saying, in the end, this is a lot about management of change from a public policy perspective. Because if it is true that change is coming so quickly, if it is true that so many actors, learners, teachers, institutions, public authorities have to change to adapt to this, well then indeed the management of change is extremely important. And I would say, and this is perhaps also a reflection on continental European university systems more than Australia, what really strikes me in your presentation and my daily experience is that there are many universities in Europe that are simply not aware of the magnitude of the change and the challenge. Indeed, I would add another element that you interestingly and perhaps not surprisingly didn't mention, because this is an issue that Australian universities in particular have addressed and have, I would say, solved very interestingly, which is the implications of what you said for funding of higher education. As you know, in most European countries, funding of higher education is in a way a taboo. Everybody realizes, not just because of the crisis and its implications for fiscal discipline, but more generally because of the raising costs of individual education at tertiary level. Everybody realizes that the ideal of a public higher education, free for everybody who cares to be educated in any possible discipline, is simply not going to happen. And it is really indispensable for higher education institutions to look at different ways of funding. And this is, I think, a critical issue, and I think many universities in Europe would do well to see how a pretty sclerotic university system in Australia in the mid-80s managed a complete transformation to be as competitive and diverse as it is today. I would also like to highlight another word that Stephanie mentioned, which is incentives. Indeed, if the key issue is to manage change, then the key issue for a policymaker is how do you put in place the right incentives for change. And this is really a challenge at European level because, as everybody knows, at European level we have pretty few competencies in education. We cannot tell countries or institutions, never mind higher education institutions, what to do, how to organize their funding, how to organize, for example, their curricula. But we can do a lot. First of all, we can tell them not what to do, but certainly how they're doing. And there is a lot of need for better evidence, especially evidence about the changing reality of education. And here at European level, we can do a lot. We can certainly provide policy guidance, which is what we're trying to do, and I'll say a few words about this. And then, most importantly, we can try to have a much better link between our policy priorities at European and national level and our financial incentives. And this is exactly what we have tried to do in the design of a new program for cooperation and mobility in education for the next 7 years, to make it more sensible and more, let's say, sensitive to change, more systemic, and to provide opportunities, for example, for better alliances between education and business, for experimentation as to the implications and potentials of digital learning, for consortia on joint degrees, for cooperation on a global scale. I think that this is really the way forward, in the sense that, as you said, Stephanie, we will not manage to find out what are the jobs we should prepare people for. We will not have a precise idea of where education institutions should go, but we should certainly try to offer opportunity to those who have a strategy to have the right support at European level. I think one other important point to mention here is the responsibility of public institutions to facilitate change, public authorities in particular. If you look at the landscape of education today, let me give you perhaps a sobering thought about the state of change. On MOOCs, you mentioned massive open online courses. They started in 2011, as you know, for real. Now they are in everybody's mind. But let me say, there was a recent survey of the European University Association, which gathers 850 of the 4,000 universities in Europe. And the result of the survey was that 1/3 of these universities didn't know what a MOOC was. 1/3 knew, but were not doing anything in particular about it. And another third were seriously considering the implications that this might have for their business model. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, first, that there's a very diversity of situations in Europe. And some universities need no lessons. They are very fast adapting. For example, some UK universities are already in alliances with Australian universities on digital learning. Some others will need a lot of help. And some others are now in a process where they would really benefit from an incentive at EU level. And this should be the challenge for our future, to try to not to tell countries what to do or institutions, but to give them the right incentives. And we'll end with one quick word about our next steps on policy. We will have on the next, I think on the 10th of July, what we call a Commission communication on the internationalization of higher education, which will try precisely to grasp the magnitude of change and the opportunities of this change at university level. And then early in September, we'll have a similar paper on digital education, which will be happily produced jointly with our colleagues in DG Connect, so that we look at supply as well as demand. With this, we will try to focus the attention of institutions and individuals on precisely the type of changes that Stephanie was mentioning. And with this, I really think I should shut up, because what this should be is a conversation, not a lecture from the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier. I don't know if Stephanie would like to react directly to what Xavier has been saying, or shall we
Well, one of the areas
go on?
I would like to comment on is the funding issue for higher education, and I think this is an area that usually takes up everyone's attention. In Australia, we know it better than most because we've just had the budget announced in Australia, and we were very pleased to hear that there was an increase in funding for K to 12 education, so from kindergarten through to year 12, but it was linked to a decrease in funding for the higher education sector. Nevertheless, there is an underlying increase in funding for higher education since 2005. So after the very poor years where the funding for higher education actually decreased in a real sense, a substantive sense, not just in a relative sense, but in a real sense, from 2005 we have experienced some increase. But the challenges for most governments, they find it very difficult to maintain funding, especially in a situation where we're going for mass education. So the current policy in Australia is that we're trying to aim for 40% of all those aged less than their mid-20s to have been through university. Now, I think the Australian universities have been quite creative around how to create funding. I think in the one of the major initiatives from the mid-80s was opening up Australian education to full fee paying international students. And at my own university, we had more than 15,000 international students out of a population of about 63,000. And the international student revenue dollar provided a little over 20% of the university's budget. Now that varies across a lot of Australian universities. It might only be 10% of the budget, others it's more than 20%. But the question is whether this is a sustainable method of subsidising education in Australia, higher education, because those funds from international students go to subsidise domestic places, but also the research agenda in Australia. So I think there are a number of questions about its sustainability, and there also have been questions asked about the ethics of using international student fees to subsidise the Australian education sector. But the other initiative was around the higher education contribution, where students pay some of the costs of their education. So if we look at the public funding for universities in Australia, it's actually declined, but it's been replaced by user pays, so domestic students, but also through international students. And the other area of focus has been the collaboration with industry to help fund research. And I think there's going to be an increased emphasis on collaboration with industry, because the research dollars made available from government are under a lot of pressure. So the alternative is to go to industry, and if industry is going to fund research in the universities, then there needs to be collaboration in terms of creating the research projects from the very beginning, not that the universities do their research and then they look for industry to help commercialise the research outcome. Industry and the universities actually need to get together and create the research topic and the research direction if we're going to have maximum impact. So I think the mix of funding in Australian universities has been very creative, and the Deputy Director General is absolutely right that it has reinvigorated the Australian education sector, but it doesn't come without its complications.
Thank you, Stephanie. And coming back to the questions that were put in the chat during your talk, Dirk was saying that we have very fast changes in R&D, especially in those ICT science areas of research. So how we can teach students knowledge at the university if the knowledge is changed so quickly that even during the full cycle of education they have to know much more than what they started with. So should we teach skills? Should we teach knowledge? How we should transfer knowledge to our students in a way that they will quickly catch up with what is going on in research?
I think it needs to be a diverse approach. People give the example of being able to drive a car. You don't have to know how a car works to enable yourself to drive. But there are some people that need to know how the car works, and especially when the car breaks down, you need someone who's going to be able to help you fix it. So I think we need specialists, and we need those who are generalists, but I believe we need both. And I also think that in terms of teaching knowledge, we can already see from our own behaviour that we don't need to retain a lot of knowledge in our own head. Even 3-year-olds now are saying to their parents, "Oh, just go and Google it." So if that's happening now, I can't imagine what it's going to be like in 10, 20, 30 years, that the interface between people and computers is going to be, perhaps that's going to be a blurred boundary as well. I can't imagine what it's like, and I suppose for me, being of my generation, I'm a little apprehensive about the blurring of that boundary, but I have no doubt that it's going to come, and it may come faster than what we think. So I think even the concept of us as human beings being independent of memory banks, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we're going to be completely dependent on computers.
This is going towards the question of Dirk as well about the smart machines and the integration. This is a very forward-looking thing, and thank you for picking up on this. Another question that I was thinking of, and this is a question both to Stephanie and to Xavier, is you were talking about the universal access. And we had a webinar last week on open science. We're discussing open access to scientific research, open access to data, but of course we can also talk about open access to knowledge. So how I can also open up the manuals, the university teaching materials to students, and what is your stand on it? Should it, or will it be open, or will it be closed? Because we're talking also about the funding. Should we make it payable for people from outside, etc.?
Perhaps I'll leave this one to Xavier.
Thank you. Well, Indeed, I think that this is a good illustration of the potential we had ahead of us. I mean, I come from Spain. Everybody knows the Quixote. Don Quixote was written 420 years ago, and for the first 400 of those 420 years, the availability of Don Quixote depended on one simple thing, which is whether there was a copy around or not. Now it is possible for everyone at any time, at any point, for free to have that. And this really is something we should stop for a moment to think about how much this has increased the potential for human knowledge. Now, then you come to the more specific challenges of what do you do to make sure that while you extend knowledge and open knowledge, you maintain quality, that you maintain the incentive for people to produce and to have the right to protection of their intellectual product. So this is really a challenging issue, but certainly what we're trying to do, and this we try to show, as I said in our communication on opening up education and technology, we try to make sure that we use the potential of technology to increase open access and to increase open knowledge. I think that there are many experiments that show that this can work, and the one that comes to mind more easily is what is happening in the Netherlands with Wikiways. This is, by the way, also a reminder that the impact of technology in education will not be confined to higher education. In the Netherlands, we have a very interesting element or experience of collaboration between private and public providers to, at the end of the day, increase dramatically access to education. So there are many avenues to explore there, and I think that this is really a promising avenue. If I may bring an image that came to mind listening to Stephanie, usually when one looks at the impact of digital and ICT on education, the usual analogy is the record industry. I think that there is a more interesting analogy, actually maybe two. One is that in a way, education is going from and internationalization of education is going from an Adam Smith economy, where basically you move people around, to an Apple economy, where you have a fragmentation of the entire production chain, and you have a much more sophisticated analysis and look at what is in the content of education. What Stephanie was saying, for example, on the specialization or the fragmentation of the role of the educator is really interesting as an avenue for the future. And the other thing also not to forget is that there is also perhaps another analogy, which is between education and the car industry. Not the car industry of the last 10 years, but the one of the beginning of last century, where many individual producers produced content, in this case a car, from scratch to the very end product, until somebody realized that you could have similar modules, similar bases, to construct an end product of a very different nature that would cater to the needs of very different types of people. And this type of specialization, this type of evolution, is something that I think is also very promising for the future as to how much, for example, blended learning can give, and how you can have a positive transformation of the business models, the back offices of educational institutions because of technology. So I would certainly not take the input of massive open online courses as just a better way to get lectures from afar. To also take the example of Stephanie with the libraries of Monash or Sydney. Well, yes, people indeed don't use libraries to get books and take them home anymore, but they go to the library much more to share. And this is also another indication of the sort of potential we have ahead of us, if only we are able to exploit it, and if only as policymakers we give the right incentives to institutions to make sure that they facilitate this type of change.
Thank you, Xavier. Now, James, thrown attention to the fact that we have also risks coming with the new education model. I was thinking before when Stephanie was talking about the new campus, a new university, that the campus used to be a discussion space, also a place where people create their identity as students, as thinkers. So if we talk about the partial funding of industry and co-creation of research goals, there's also a risk of responding to demand which is not forward-looking and not asking the big questions. So how would you respond to this question of James, how that we still need critical thinkers and philosophers, and if we cut on our budget to respond only to market demand, we will have this less and less?
I can only agree. I think it is a challenge. And how do you maintain a space for the humanities and for languages? That's why I would argue that within the education space, what we need is diversity, and diversity creates, well, it is the basis actually for creativity. And I think one of the challenges of the globalization, I mean, it comes back to that whole globalization debate. Are we going, through globalization, are we going to have increased homogeneity, or are we going to allow diversity to exist? And if we look at global politics, and I suppose the European Union might be a good example. The Union has been in place for many, many years, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting homogeneity. There's respect for languages. I had the opportunity to visit the Commission and to see all the different booths for the interpreters. So I suppose it's the cultural guidance that's required with these sorts of changes, and to know, to have that balance, and to know that diversity actually does create or lay the basis for creativity. But I think it is a challenge, and that's why I think it's important not to allow any of the different actors to take control of the enterprise. As I was saying, I don't think government should be too interventionist. I don't think the church should be too interventionist. I don't think industry should be too interventionist. But I think we have a balance, and how we create that balance, I suppose, is through the good sense of humanity. I think that I'm ultimately very optimistic about the way in which people see their future.
Thanks, Stephanie. And this brings me also to the incentive and the big issue of certification and accreditation of skills and competences, because in DigiConnect we have ongoing discussion as well about the certification of e-skills, how we can recognize the digital skills, and going to the university. You said that many universities in Australia recognize the prior experience, and especially if we talk about the lifelong learning path, people will come to universities with prior experience from the jobs, from in other informal learning environments. How we can ascertain that this is not lost in the educational process, and this is recognized from the beginning, so people don't feel that it's something they have to rework. So this is also the question for Xavier: how we can make a policy that is making the certification answer to the new challenges.
Yes, if I may say a word on this. First of all, I think we do really have a challenge to make sure that progress in education is not limited to what is very useful in the short term for industry. This is really very important. I must say, however, that when I look at the shape of education and higher education in Europe, I think that we have another much simpler challenge. We simply must make sure that all sorts of education and faculties are actually of good quality, that they have a strategy to justify what added value they provide, that they link to other disciplines, that they don't see themselves, or they don't confuse, if I may put it brutally, they don't confuse independence of thought with autism and lack of connection with the real world. There is often this sort of, I think, very simplistic dichotomy whether, are you doing something useful for thought and knowledge, or something for the labor market or for the economy? I think the answer is both. It's very difficult to imagine somebody who will have a fantastic education and that could not apply that education in his or her daily life. So I think that what we need is really a call to arms to make sure that we have a more relevant interesting education system, and that will address many of the problems besides. It's just that the difference between computer technology and philosophy is that computer technology is more immediately subject to the pressures of industry. But that doesn't mean that their contribution is not as important. So I think this is really a critical issue to consider. As concerns, I think, certification, I think there is one thing that we really should be thinking of at the Commission. We have constructed a series of processes on validation of knowledge, certification, recognition of diplomas, which are based on the assumption that you essentially have to be clear about what a diploma is. And yet what we see is that, as Stephanie showed, is that this is less and less important. What matters is what people can do, how they construct an interesting combination of talents. And we should think again whether the emphasis should be on a static definition of equivalent diplomas, or whether we should look at different ways to ensure that people can be recognized for what they know. I have no answer for this, but I think we should not simply imagine that all these changes in the world of education, in the way people teach and learn, should have no impact in the institutional setting around them. And the institutional setting around them looks to me as actually very static with respect to the time when we started this process at European level. So things to think about on how we should make sure that institutions lead rather than follow the changes in society.
Yeah, I would like to remind you
I
that.
think the issue.
Sorry, Stephanie, go on.
No, I was just going to add a footnote to what Xavier was saying, and I think he's absolutely right. I think the issue of credentials is one of the probably the most controversial and for some people within the university unthinkable areas of change. But I've now left the university and I've moved to a firm, Ernst & Young, and we do a lot of work in advising government departments and universities themselves on how they might be able to orchestrate change within their area. The firm employs 167,000 people around the world. So the question that I was pondering is, what would happen if a firm like Ernst & Young decided that the credentials of people coming from university were less relevant than those people who sat an assessment exercise put in place by an assessment testing or a testing firm, and there are a number of those who are actually moving into this space. What would happen if our firm decided that the capacity of a good accountant could be tested through a series of exams, and that we said we don't mind where people get the qualifications or where they get the knowledge, whether they're self-taught, whether they've been educated anywhere in the world? What would happen then if the credential was tested by an independent firm and then a firm like ours actually recognised that rather than just relying on the university qualification? I think that's going to be a game changer for universities. But I think there are also areas where we don't need credentials, and even the putting together of credentials or of different courses and different mixes of expertise, that we don't need that. And it might be that someone needs some knowledge about a particular issue. And an example that was quoted to me recently is around Alzheimer's. So it's becoming an increasingly challenging problem within our ageing community. There are a number of people who want to know about Alzheimer's. They want to know what causes it, how it can be treated, so they can form a group around learning about that particular problem. And it's not only the information that they gain through doing this type of course, they also become part of a community of people who are interested in this problem, and then they can actually support each other in the changes. So the people who go through a course like that don't necessarily look for a credential, they're looking for something else. So it's not only about credentials. People don't only want knowledge because of credentials that they can acquire.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. I just wanted to remind you that the floor is open to participants as well. So we would like to make a comment on what Stephanie and Xavier are saying, not through the chat, but through audio. You can raise your hand and I will give you the floor as well. As we have still some time for discussion. And meanwhile, yeah, I was wondering to go back to the question of involvement on industry. Jonathan Murray from Digital Europe was putting an example of UK universities that organize these co-created, co-funded courses that are responding to industry demand. What else would other examples of funding, maybe from Australia, you can give us, Stephanie, that involves industry into the university curriculum?
I'm not sure that Australia is the best example of industry university collaboration around curriculum, although we do have overseeing our universities, we have councils, and those councils, by legislation, have business people involved. Each degree program, broad degree program, and usually more so in business and the engineering areas, will have advisory boards, and those advisory boards will comprise majority of people from business. But it seems to me that there's much more work that could be done in terms of the collaboration. Recently there was a survey done by the Australian Industry Group of its members, and they looked at whether industry was happy with the graduates that they were receiving from the university. And in some areas they were happy, but by and large they weren't so happy. And I'm not sure that any industry group is happy, so I'm not quite sure that you can compare it to other countries. I think our graduates are actually very fine graduates. But I think that the responsibility then is for industry to reach back into the universities and to work together in developing curriculum, but also it's not only the curriculum side, it's also allowing the mobility of academic staff to work within industry and then move back into the university. Because in Australia, and I think this is the case in many countries, that there are disincentives for academics to leave the university sector, because once you leave it's very difficult to get back in. And also when you're looking for that return into the university, people will say, well, what have you published over the last 5 years? What research funding have you brought in? And you say, well, I was working for industry. And so you're not very competitive with someone who has stayed within the sector. So there are disadvantages for people moving in and out of industry. So I think it's universities that should be changing the incentive scheme, but also industry reaching out to universities and trying to pull some of the academics into the industry itself. And I think the second area where we're starting to make a change is with work integrated learning. So now most universities, and in some of their degrees, are moving to a point where we encourage students to do an internship as part of their course, as part of their degree. Some of those internships will take place over the summer break. Some of the internships are in lieu of one semester coursework. So it's working together with industry to have a more integrated experience. But I would argue that we need to do that much earlier in the education pathway. I think if industry can work together with some of our high schools and help coach some of our graduates around what the different work streams might look like, I think we might have a smoother transition from school into university and into the workplace. Often students they move laterally rather than moving directly ahead. And coming from my background, I look at the productivity of the university space. And one of the ways you can measure productivity is if a student starts off at A and works right through A, B, C, D, E and graduates. But what we find now is a student might start in A and move to A1 and move to A2 and then move back to B, and where it might normally take, well, theoretically it could take a student 3 years to complete an undergraduate degree. In some cases it takes 5 years, and those students get lost in the process. So I think a role for industry is actually to reach back through the universities and even into the schools to try to familiarise students with what it might be to have a career as an architect, or to have a career in IT, or to have a career in another area. So I think that that collaboration is actually going to improve our productivity and improve the experience for the individual as well.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. On the last point, this is very interesting because what we were discussing also ahead of the Digital Agenda Assembly is how industry can get to young people and present their opportunities already in the secondary school, and build the role models, especially in the industries that are right now facing the gap in demand. So we're talking about the ICT sector, and breaking with stereotypes of geeks working there and presenting more opportunities for women especially to join the ICT career. But I would like to give the floor back to Xavier, because he was saying, yeah, we have a lot of policies on business university cooperation, so I'm eager to hear what kind of, if you can give us just a short introduction.
Yes, yes, indeed. Indeed. I mean, the first thing is indeed that we don't know exactly exactly what kind of alliances one will have in 5 years' time, but we had the sense that there was a big potential there if we provided the right incentives. So what we set up is something we call knowledge alliances, and we had, for the start, 2 pilot projects last year and this one, precisely to promote strategic cooperation, meaning beyond just an opportunistic drive to get funding from a public source. A strategic alliance between stakeholders in business and education. And let me give you proof that there is no such dramatic risk of humanities being left aside. In the 2 pilot projects we had, which actually had extraordinarily interesting results, I'll give you one example that comes to mind. This was a project we are funding, which is led by the Center for Applied Archaeology of University College London, with La Sapienza in Roma, and a number of private companies. The point being that in the cultural and creative sector, there's a need to have innovative methods, to have more entrepreneurial attitudes, and therefore, in order to increase the entrepreneurial mindset in students and promote entrepreneurship in classical disciplines, this is a project we set up. But the point is that we are using these 2 pilot projects to have a massive new initiative with maybe 350 million euro in the new Erasmus program, not to have a typology of initiatives that we want to fix, but just to set the conditions for candidates to apply for good, interesting projects of cooperation between business and university. And we have a lot of faith that this will give rise to areas of cooperation that precisely we are not guessing now, but which are there if only one can tap them. And this is indeed what we're trying to do. The other thing I should mention very briefly is the EIT, the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, where I happen to be the Commission representative in the Board of Governors. This is exactly an institution set up to strengthen the link, not so much between research and business, many people do that, but between research, business, and education. And this is, I think, another interesting experiment where we're trying to increase incentives. And at the end of the day, it is about incentives.
Thanks a lot, Xavier.
Can I
Yeah,
Can I
sure.
just make a short footnote, and that is to compliment Xavier on the work that he's been doing around business and university cooperation. And I was fortunate enough to participate in a conference last week. I think it might have been the third conference on university business collaboration. And I must say the quality of the papers and the forward thinking of that group, who have now met on an annual basis, was just extraordinary. And I understand that Xavier is a major force behind that collaboration. So I think it's world class. So I congratulate you.
Thank you. Maybe a force, but I'm certainly not the only force there. I hope not a destructive one. But yes, I think it's an interesting.
Thanks a lot both to Xavier and Stephanie. We are slowly running out of time, and I think this is the place to give back the floor to Franco, who is very silent, only intervening at the chat level, and give you the closure time for this very interesting meeting.
Yeah, indeed, I have been listening to this very interesting conversation. So a big thanks really to Stephanie for illuminating a bit our path for the coming years, challenges and opportunities. A big thanks to Xavier certainly for reminding us that we are already doing quite a lot of initiatives in education, thinking it together with the business and the environment and the experience of the EIC. It's all fantastic. So in one sense, the future is already here. We are already building the future. However, I think that there are quite a lot of challenges because sometimes we claim that the technology is, we overemphasize the role of technology. We know, for instance, that ahead of us, we need to have even more powerful environment and tools to support the future of education. For instance, the mixed realities environment, the idea of having a 3D immersive environment in all universities that would allow anyone to participate to courses delivered from all around the world, and having really the feeling to be there and listening to the real in-person So basically, there are already quite a lot of possibilities ahead of us, but are we ready for the big thing? That's the big issue that basically remains unsolved because it's a continuous change, and we need to adapt our policies to cope with the transformation. At the same time, be reasonable enough in the policies to call for appropriate support from the research and innovation stream, where industry definitely plays an important role. So all of these things will be an important subject of discussion in the next week in the brainstorming we will do at the Digital Future with the high-level group of the Digital Agenda for Europe, where we will be together with the digital champions, with a bunch of other thinkers and movers from all around Europe, including some 30 Erasmus students. And certainly the discussion will continue elsewhere as well. So just a few words about the follow-up. So this was a webinar in the context of Digital Future, which is a foresight exercise launched by Robert Madeline and Molly Cruz some few months ago, and it's going to continue until the end of the year. Why we do that is basically we want to be prepared ahead for the reflection time that will be around the renewal of the European framework in 2015. So, and in general, to think about future policy. So, education is definitely one of the most important policies, where, by the way, European intervention is impact-free, and so it was very, very interesting today to discuss about it. But I hope that it will not stop here. I hope that we will continue the journey together and maybe we can leave it for a separate interaction with Stephanie and certainly with Xavier for checking maybe a series of conversations related to education is linked to the future society in general. So let us stay in touch, try to become a Futurizen, and subscribe to the Futurion platform which we have set up to host the content developed during our journey. So, and let's stay in touch, as I said. Thank you very much to all. Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Stephanie. And see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks to all of you. And thanks especially to Stephanie,
Okay.
as I said.
And nice to speak with you again, Xavier.
Thank you.
So
I know you have better things to do on a 10 p.m. on a holiday, but so we are even more grateful for being with us. Thank you.
So thanks a lot.
very much.
We're closing the meeting. The chat will stay open for a while, and we will see you next time for the next Future Friday or Monday meeting and the webinar. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Anybody still there?